to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
And we take roll call vote, please.
Stephanie Como,
Here.
Todd Holzman,
Present.
Patrick Clark,
Here.
Dale Jacobson,
Present.
Janelle Birnbaum, present. Tom McVeigh,
Present.
Ruth Johnson, present. Dr. Montez,
Present.
Pam Shipley, present. Bob Houston,
Present.
Mike Nifko.
Present. At this time of the election,
Mr. Vice Chair, may I remind the members of the commission to turn their mics on by pushing the button in the very front where it says push.
okay, I thought they were on, sorry.
All right.
No need to start over, do we?
No.
At this time, I'll have election of officers.
Mr. Vice Chair, I'd like to make a nomination for officers. I'd like to nominate Mike Nevko as chair. I'd like to nominate Todd Holzman as vice chair and Dale Jacobson as secretary.
I need a second.
Second.
Any other nominations? If not, have election then. Go ahead and vote, please, by roll call, or not roll call, but, hey, I'm gonna vote? Yeah. Okay.
Aye.
All in
Aye.
favor? Aye. Opposed? None so moved, pass unanimously. I thought since we don't have TIF meetings very often, just might explain a little bit to people that are not aware. There's 11 TIF commissioners, 6 for the city, 2 for the school board, 2 for the county, and 1 for the other taxing districts. So I now entertain a motion to approve the minutes of the November the 18th, 2014 meeting as presented.
So, second?
Are there any questions or corrections? All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Any nays? So moved. I'll now entertain a motion and a second to approve the minutes of the January 13th, 2016 as presented. Are there any questions or corrections?
I so move.
Second.
Have a motion and a second. There were several people not here. I will abstain because I was not here for the meeting. But all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any nays? So moved. I'm sorry?
Abstain. I was not present.
Okay, you get that, Dan? So moved. Okay. This time I'd like to open the public hearing for the Highway 58 and Dean Avenue TIF plan. Would the developer representative please come and address the commission?
Mr. Chairman, good afternoon. My name is Kurt Peterson with the Polsinelli Law Firm. It's nice to be here this afternoon. I'm here on behalf of the proposed developer for this project, which is Cadence Real Estate. And Trip Ross sits to my right. He's one of the principals of Cadence. Also, Justin Kaufman is behind me, another principal of Cadence. Before we dive into the actual site and the proposed project for the site, I thought I might just take all of about 60 seconds to give you a little bit of a flavor on who is here before you, asking for a public-private partnership to do a project, as I always think that's a pretty fundamental ingredient in baking the cake. Cadence owns and manages in the Kansas City region upwards of $200 million of real estate assets. Some of their specialties, where you'd really find, I guess, their bread and butter would be retail shopping centers, both developing, owning, and operating those, especially those that are anchored by grocery tenants. Also, they do a fair amount, especially with one of their affiliates, of GSA build-to-suit projects and industrial projects. But really relevant to this project, given that this is an infill, we would say redevelopment site, I wanted to mention just a few of their highlights when it comes to this type of project. One would be a project that some of you may know by name, some by sight, Prescott Plaza. Maybe about 4 years ago, they underwent the project along I-70 in Kansas City, Kansas, just east of 635, which you can see from I-70 to the north, and really took it from it was a truck stop and a former motel, and now you see a vibrant, sun-fresh, anchored, full retail center on that site. So that would be one project. It was a pretty major project that they did quite well on. Another project that you'll see coming out of the ground this year is in Blue Springs, which will be called the White Oak Marketplace. It's 20-plus anchors. It'll be anchored by a 84,000-foot approximately price chopper. Also very interesting, a senior living component in this project as well as other retail. Finally, those were both examples of infill redevelopment where Cadence actually was the owner developer. I also wanted to draw to your attention one project that I was able to work with them on in their capacity as leasing agent for two projects in Prairie Village that some of you may have heard of. The Prairie Village Shopping Center, located at 71st and Mission, and then the Corinth Shopping Center at 83rd and Mission. And for those of you that either frequent there or read the papers, it was quite a transformation done with a public-private partnership. But Cadence, again, their principals were very involved in going out with their deep relationships in the retail and restaurant tenant community, and some of those names that you all may know from frequenting there in terms of restaurants that were brought to our community for the first time, or at least to that part of town, really were at the hands of Justin and Tripp. So very good relationships with retailers and restaurants. And so overall, the point in that 60-plus seconds was Cadence and its principals have the experience, both on the developing, the ownership, the leasing, the relationships with bringing great tenants to the city, and then also just the financial wherewithal and experience. So Cadence is the proposed developer, but skipping next to what really is the next most important item, which is a piece of dirt. There's a site we're dealing with, and on your screens you can see, and in your packet that you had, you know that it's the southeast corner of Dean and 58 Highway. Skipping to a closer up view, on the property right now, which is approximately just over 3 acres, there's a house, which again, many of us from just growing up around have seen that house forever, old farmhouse from the Dean family, and then also a barn and 4 other, I'd call it just outbuildings or minor structures. The site is surrounded on all sides by commercial. Just running through that quickly, we know this, but on the west you have Walmart and various retail pads. On the north, across 58, you have more retail pads. On the east, at least immediately east, you have the Golden Corral restaurant. And then to the south, you have Lowe's and Sam's and some other retail/commercial pads. So clearly something that's surrounded by commercial. In fact, again, this is intuitive view, but the city's future land use plan, no surprise, called out in the yellow boxes, our site there, is that this would be commercial someday. Just hasn't gotten there yet. So the site, again, I know I won't spend any more time on it because I know you're all very aware of the site. The item we'll go to next is an item that's part of your ultimate findings, we hope today, which is to find that this site is eligible for tax increment financing under Missouri law. And to find that, one of the items that needs to be included in your findings that this is a conservation area under Missouri law. And in your packet, I will not go through. We are available as long as you'd like to answer questions and dig in deeper, but I will give this a high level because I know you had both the conservation area study as part of the TIF plan, and you also had a memorandum from legal counsel to the city and the TIF Commission, Mr. Bushek, that went into these factors and did a good job of summarizing them. But I will do even higher level summary for the record, Mr. Chairman. The first requirement I'd call it two fundamental requirements for y'all to find a conservation area here for this site, is that at least 50% or more of the structures currently on the site have to be at least 35 years or older. And so as you saw as part of the conservation study, this was documented through the county assessor, county appraiser's office, that all 6, and you can see on your screens, again, that's the house, and the other 5 related structures, all of them are over 35 years old, so this is not a hard burden to meet on this particular criterion. The second major item, and the last one that you have to find in order to determine that this is a conservation area, is that at least 3 of a number of factors that are set forth in the statute for a conservation area are indeed present on this site. So again, this is where I'll give a higher level review. But the primary factors that were found here in the conservation study and that we would put before you as to be part of your finding is that there's dilapidation that's occurring on this site, and primarily that is with the outbuildings and some of the infrastructure. There's obsolescence. Really, this tends to go to, under Missouri law, is this the highest and best use? What is the taxes being generated for the taxing jurisdictions by this property? And I think that one probably speaks for itself. The tax bill for this site is approximately $1,800 a year, which is much, much, much different than the surrounding parcels. Third, deterioration, very similar to dilapidation, something less than that, something that, maintenance is required, but it hasn't quite got to an advanced stage of deterioration. Again, the pictures you saw in the conservation study probably pointed you to that conclusion. Below code structures, this doesn't even really need an in-depth professional analysis, because when something is built in the early part of the 20th century, it almost always by rule does not, in a lot of ways, meet current code. Vacancy, this is completely vacant. There's no use right now of this property by the owner. And finally, deleterious land use or layout. Again, the legislature was a little bit overlapping when they came up with these criteria. This is very similar to the obsolescence in that it's really asking the question, is this the highest and best use for the site, and is it really in the public good? And again, I would subject to any questions you might have, I would say that probably it speaks for itself as we looked at the future land use plan and the surrounding uses around this former farmhouse. So, Chairman, with that is all I will affirmatively speak to in the way of the conservation area finding, but again, happy to answer any questions on that. Before now getting to the actual project, what this developer proposes for you and the financing structure related to that, I wanted to give a few minutes or less even to the site history, because it is relevant, because anytime a developer comes before this body or a similar body and says, we need help, it makes sense, I personally think, to look back to what's happened in recent years. Well, how did we get to this point? Are we sure this site needs help? With that, it's obvious to anybody that gets off 71 on a 58 and comes into the city of Raymore that, I say this loosely, but as they get to this site, something is wrong. And I don't mean it's not great to have history. I don't mean that there's not some quaintness to the farmhouse. I don't mean that at all. But something is wrong. Why would some of the bigger box retailers in the country, as well as other regional and local retail, surround this site on all sides, and this site would stay the way it is? At least that occurs to me when I see this site. And the answer is, others have tried to bring this in conformity with the city's vision and the aesthetics and the uses around it, but they failed. For example, several years ago, there was a different well-known developer that came in and spent a lot of time that we have personal knowledge and experience with, trying to figure out if there was a financially sound way, including with public incentives, to bring the right type of users and develop the right kind of economics to redevelop the site. And again, we have firsthand knowledge, both Tripp, Justin, and I, that they were unsuccessful, and in all their experience, they couldn't find a way to make it work. That was several years ago. And then approximately, time flies, 18 months ago, 12 to 18 months ago, there was another developer that I actually represented and worked hard with them and their vision of what can make this site work. And we spent a lot of time with the city, and they spent a lot of their actually time and money. And again, saying nothing about their experience and financial wherewithal, they couldn't quite make it work with the level of incentives that they thought might be available. Then we come to today. And I've already told you about Cadence, and Cadence has been watching this site for some time. And even though it's a tough site, and it's probably worth pausing and asking, what do I mean by tough site? That's a lot of why we're here. One would be access. As you notice from this site, there's probably intuitive to many of you, there's not going to be access to the west because of the throat, if you will, and the stacking as you get on 58 when you're on Dean Avenue. Access to the south is currently prohibited based on some land records and things like that. Access to the east is difficult because you have a grade change in an already developed property there. And then you have your access, which is crucial to 58. And as all of you looking around know, a number of you in your backgrounds know that a single access point is very challenging. And I will tell you right now that we are working hard on developing a second access point, and that's in the works. But all to say, regardless of what we're hopefully going to be able to do, having only one automatic access point is a big challenge. Challenge number one of the site. Number two is land price. Now, this is a well-situated site, and we're not trying to complain too much about the seller, but it's a reality, and it has been a reality for years. This is a solid sales price, and that factors into to each developer's pro forma. Third is this definitely, for the kind of development that we're proposing, will require the addition of a decel lane on Highway 58, so off-site costs with that. Also, the rights were not given to the folks that have a regional detention in the area for this site to use that regional detention. Thus, in trying to make the economics for it, you not only have to squeeze enough users on to make it pencil to build this project and redevelop the site, you have to squeeze water treatment for yourself on the site. So you have to find some way to squeeze that on. That's a challenge. Also, to a lesser degree, but still real, there's oil and septic tanks that need to be removed, and issues from experience can arise as you do that. Sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's a little bit harder. So that's just something that needs to be faced. And then lastly, I'd say soil issues, and really in talking to the geotechnical experts, which are not me, they say, first of all, there's a fair amount of rock. As to exactly how much rock they're going to encounter on the types, they've done a little bit of testing, but that's a variable that a developer has to take the risk with. And then also a heavier than usual moisture level, which again, I could give you no explanation of what that means really, but the engineers say that is something they're facing. So with that kind of smattering of issues, you start to understand why these previous developers had so much trouble, why they ultimately said we're going to have to pass as much as this site is just calling out to be brought up to its highest and best use. With that sounds all very negative, I know, but this developer, Cadence, has identified a plan that after much diligence that I've been able to be a part of the last few months, they absolutely, with the public incentives package that we're talking about today, they believe they can make this project a success. And that's what we want to talk about now. So in looking at, before getting into really the numbers, let's look at just the qualitative, the plan itself, and the layout, et cetera. So on your screens now is the proposed conceptual site plan. Conceptual only because we're getting very close. We're working with a lot of tenants, but as you know, and as the header to this plan stated in the TIF plan, around the edges there may be some growing and shrinking in building size, but this is really where we focused in talking to tenants in terms of a 3-building layout and generally this size. So let's go left, west to east or left to right, however you think of it on the screen. The first building, or building A, which I think in the packet and the memorandum is called the Retail Restaurant A. That's because this is a multi-tenant building that Cadence would build and lease and continue to own. And right now, in the size would be anywhere from the smallest that we've seen as we've talked to different tenants and put the building together would be about 7,700-ish, 7,700, and the biggest with a couple different tenants we would lay it out as about 10,000 feet, and you just start running into parking trouble after that. So that's the range we're talking about. We modeled it based on 9,750 in that range, the higher end, because we think that's the most likely given the tenants we're talking to right now. The first one tenant that is as much as you can be sure of anything is K Jewelers, which we are thrilled about, which is the biggest, you may know, maybe have some buying experience there, is the biggest jeweler in the world with their network. Very nice stores, and if you look at the first building on the left side, the end cap that faces west will be a K Jewelers. We are working on the lease right now. We have a signed term sheet, and it's been approved by their committee. So this is far down the path, assuming we can get all this approved, for a K Jeweler to plant its flag right there on the end cap. On the other side of and this gives you kind of an elevation look of that building. On the other side of that building, we've been really focusing on several different restaurants. We've had some real interest in some attractive restaurants to put on the other end, which is our goal. Could it be retail? It absolutely could end up being retail. You all have had experience with real estate. We are absolutely dead set on finding the best tenants that we can. We've had a real good amount of interest. We'd like a restaurant, but we'll see. And then you saw the elevations above. So moving to the second building, going back to the site plan. The second building in the middle of the site is approximately, we expect to be about a 3,000-foot pad that we would build and lease, and we are far down the path with Cadova. I don't know, it's becoming a name that more of us recognize, really in the last, I'd call it, year or so. Although they would probably not want to be called Chipotle. If you're trying to get a sense for the general, it's different, but the general type of food, it's a Chipotle-like concept that is hot across the country that I experienced when I was in college, and it is really It's a great place. And this is their prototype building that, assuming we're able to actually get the lease done, again, they're far along, they have a signed term sheet with us. It would look something like this, and I think there's even an interior shot trip after that to give just a sense that this is, this is a nice building, this is a happening place, and I think something that we'd all be proud to have in Raymore at this site. So that's building number 2. Again, that's something we would build and lease to this tenant. The last building is almost certainly something we would ground lease. We have a lot of different interest in this. This would be a restaurant almost certainly, and really somebody that has been clamoring to be here. Have not gotten a term sheet signed with them yet is Panda Express, but again, it could be someone else, but almost certainly would be, we think would be a standalone restaurant. Again, we're on the far east side of the site here, and it, as shown, has a drive-through, may or may not have a drive-through, but Panda Express, if it was them, certainly would. Lastly, in terms of rounding out the site plan and the general contours of what we're trying to do here, you see detention, if you can read it. And I call it the southwest part of the site. Detention is there because, again, we have no right to use the regional detention. And then lastly, I would go to a slide that's a little bit hard to read, but I guess you could focus over in the middle on the right where it says City of Raymore. We've been talking to the city, and again, we're early on because TIF Commission comes first, but just informally to say, this is a special site. There's history here. It's not only special because it's the Dean family farm site, but it's also special because it's very much a gateway site for the city, for anybody, coming in and heading east. And so we've been kind of open hands, just saying, do you have any ideas? And so far where we're at is it seems like, subject to further discussions with the city, that perhaps putting a very nice monument sign, if you will, on that hard corner of Dean and 58 could be a way to recognize that, hey, welcome to Raymore. Again, that's just us right now, and I'm sure there'll be more iterations of that or something different, but we thought it was relevant, and we wanted to show you because that's part of our cost and something that we're looking at. So with that, Mr. Chairman, that is the proposed project. It does naturally take us into the budget. What does this cost? And then ultimately into the financing. In front of you is a sources and uses that was included in the TIF plan that you've already seen. This is as you know, over $9 million project for everything that you saw on that site plan. In terms of the public incentives request, it would really be two-pronged. One is primarily related to what we're doing today, which is the tax increment financing. But the second, the community improvement district, I always like to bring up because, as I'll emphasize again in a moment, that helps minimize the TIF, and we were very intentional about that, so I'll talk about that more in a minute. But the two prongs are a TIF and a community improvement district with a 1% sales tax. The request for reimbursement of costs from the tax increment financing revenues would be up to $1.375 million plus interest. So kind of present value dollars, $1.375 million for the budget, and then also as we get paid back on a pay-as-you-go basis, we would get paid back our interest carry, which right now we're modeling now. All of a sudden, I forgot the exact interest rate, but it's in your packet. I think 5.5%. The CID would be a 1% sales tax on all sales within the district. The district, probably intuitive view, but the district would be the very site we just looked at, not beyond that. And we would ask for reimbursement from the CID for up to $387,525, again, with pay-as-you-go interest paid to the developer. Something you know, but just for clarification, the $387,525 is actually half, right, of the 1% CID sales tax, because under Missouri law, economic activity taxes include any community improvement district sales tax, and economic activity taxes, or EATs, capture half of all such taxes, and thus the TIF, when I gave that number, actually grabbed half of the CID, and thus when I say CID, the 387, it's actually the non-captured half of the CID. So just for clarification. The total amount then requested on this $9.1 and change $1 million budget would be reimbursement over time to the developer of $1.762,525 with interest, which as a percentage of the total would be 15% with TIF and 5% incentives to cost for the CID, which I will say is pretty reasonable based on what has gone on here and in the region, really. So drawing attention to that. The TIF and CID really, as you look at the sources and uses in front of you, would only be asked to help with two things, which is very consistent with the list of, call it barriers to development that we talked about. That is partial land cost reimbursement and then also partial site work cost reimbursement to help deal with those barriers that other developers have faced. Estimated duration, this is always important. It's always important to the taxing jurisdictions, and so, you know, I highlight that the estimated duration that you saw in the TIF plan and in the modeling that was attached was approximately 12 years for this TIF before it's paid back the requested amount with interest to the developer. Now, for those of you that have been around for a couple plans or a couple projects, I will tell you, as doing this and other real estate activities for a living, this is fairly remarkable. You don't usually see a request that comes in that estimates such a short duration, and I will tell you why that's the case. From the time Cadence came in and started working with this, they were clear with me, and I've worked with them for a long time. They said, we really, right out of the gate, we don't want to play a negotiation game, if you will, and come in real high and work it down. Let's figure out exactly what we need, and if it takes 5 years or 17 years or something else, let's ask for that. That's why you see an ask that's only 12 years. Remember I said I'd bring up the CID again and why we really do it? We do the CID 1% sales tax because that would go for 17 years. It's helping to cram down. The more you get from the CID, the less you need from the TIF. That's part of why you're seeing a TIF part that's only at 12 years. So those really work in tandem. So said back to you, we estimate in all our modeling that the city's looked at that the TIF would go on for 12 years based on all the assumptions, and the CID would go on for 17. The rate of return, because we do need to find but for this assistance that's requested, that the developer would not be able to do the project, the rate of return that's been presented shows a negative return if there's no assistance. If the developer just did everything we just said on this budget, there'd be it doesn't make sense. They lose money. With the assistance requested, it's approximately 14% leveraged internal rate of return on a 10-year sale assumption, which, again, as most of you know, and we can dig into deeper, is not super high and it's not super low. It's especially for a project of this size where there's a lot of risk associated with leasing. That is, if you build buildings and you don't have tenants that are paying or tenants that are filling all your space, and there's a lot of risk on a project of this size. So 14% we felt like was really the bare minimum and something that was justifiable and reasonable. So with that, that is really the request in short, and really the final, Mr. Chairman, the final issue to cover is, well, what about the taxing jurisdictions? So what do the revenues look like to the taxing jurisdictions? And that's why the cost-benefit analysis attached to the TIF plan can be very helpful. The summary of it is on your screen. Again, I won't go through everybody's constituency, if you will, because I know you can review that yourself. But I will note that because of the ability to have this TIF pay off in much shorter than the statutory allowable 23 years, that and taking into account both the city, the state, and the county have the sales tax levy, and the fire district have a sales tax levy, that because each only capture half immediately, there's a fairly significant amount of revenues that are going to those jurisdictions, and when the TIF pays off, there's a significant amount that goes to everybody. And so we're very happy this is the case, is that we hope it makes decisions easier, and it certainly beats the whopping $1,800 that all of the taxing jurisdictions, in terms of real property tax levy, there's no sales obviously, split right now, and short of a developer being able to come together and form a partnership with the city, would conceivably go on for years to come. So we're pleased with the way this came out, and with that, we're thrilled to be here with this project, Mr. Chairman, and like I said, we have as long as you want to answer all the questions that anybody on the commission has, and thank you for your time and being here this afternoon.
Thank you. Mr. Bouchak, would you like to address the commission?
Good afternoon. My name is David Bushak. I'm an attorney with the law firm of Gilmore & Bell. We are Economic Development Counsel and Bond Counsel to the city. I will provide testimony this afternoon on behalf of the city team, which I have worked with to prepare the proceedings this afternoon for you. I would start with entering into the record the exhibits. These are exhibits 1 through 12. In the meeting packet that was delivered to you, there was this list of exhibits. These exhibits primarily prove up compliance with the procedural requirements, as well as entering the plan and other important documents into the record. Brief summary of the plan. The applicant presented most of the points that I was prepared to cover if they hadn't, so I won't repeat any of the testimony that they've already provided. A few other points that I think are relevant to your consideration and the city's consideration. This is a pay-as-you-go TIF plan. The applicant is not proposing to issue any bonds, not requesting the city to issue any bonds. So the developer will finance the entire project, and as the revenues are received by the city or by the Community Improvement District, those would be paid over to the developer. So the city will not be issuing bonds. That's not part of their request. The two revenue sources, again, applicant covered this, but I'll also mention this briefly. The property tax increment, the payment in lieu of taxes. This is approximately 17% of the entire revenue from the TIF side that's proposed through the TIF plan. The economic activity taxes are about 83% of the total TIF revenue. The applicant has incorporated into the plan a surplusing of half of the captured property tax increment, which means that half of all the property taxes will flow as normal to the taxing districts. And then that is also the statutory limit with the sales taxes. So both on the property tax increment and the sales tax increment, half will flow to the taxing districts, half will be captured for reimbursement to the developer. The applicant already covered the Community Improvement District, and just to be clear, the Community Improvement District proposal is not before you, but it's an important component of the financing, which is why the developer covered it. And as was also mentioned, half of that new sales tax is captured as TIF revenue, so that does play a role in your consideration, since half of those new revenues will become TIF revenues under the TIF plan. As was discussed, the proposed duration, the projected duration of this plan is 12 years. So the projection is by year 13, the TIF would be terminated and all of the tax revenues would flow as normal to the taxing districts. And then the Community Improvement District would last for a longer period, about additional 5 years. There is no request for the city to contribute any additional revenues that are captured by this TIF plan. As a point of comparison, with at least one other TIF plan in the city, there is a component of an extra contribution from the city from the non-captured revenues. That is not the request in this case. And as I mentioned, there's no request for the city to issue debt, so there's no request for the city to back any of the developer's debt. It's completely financed initially by the developer from private financing. The required findings, the applicant covered certain of these findings very thoroughly. So I'll just briefly mention these, as these are included in your resolution. You have a conservation area study, and you heard extensive testimony this afternoon regarding the nature of the property and how it fits the definition of a conservation area. You have heard presentation this afternoon regarding the cost-benefit analysis, and they've presented the slide that's still up on your screen regarding that finding. The but-for finding, you've heard testimony this afternoon regarding the need for the use of TIF in this case. And the most compelling evidence, I suppose, on this point is the fact that the property still sits vacant and has not been developed despite the surrounding commercial development. The developer also spoke to the financial feasibility and the fact that they're prepared to undertake this plan if the TIF plan is approved. And their, I would say, more advanced stages of negotiations with the tenants is a plus in this case. There are many instances where the developer is not this far along in discussions with tenants. So that's helpful evidence in consideration today. And then the memo that I provided to you that's in your packet also goes through all of the various required components of a TIF plan. I won't elaborate on these, but this is documented in your memo, pointing out where all of the required components of a TIF plan are set forth in the various exhibits that have been presented to you. So the plan is ready for your consideration, ready for action by the City Council. One procedural issue that I want to mention for the record is last week, notice of changes to the plan were sent to the taxing district as required by the TIF Act. In the cost-benefit analysis, which is Exhibit 10 to the TIF plan, there was a miscalculation, and I think it was as simple as a math error in one of the cells of the spreadsheets. It didn't factor in surplusing of 50% of the property taxes to the taxing districts. So that was corrected by the applicant. That is now on file with the city, and that is part of the plan. There was also a very minor change to Exhibit 7 to clarify how the plan turns off after 12 years based on the developer's projections. A few comments regarding how the plan compares to the city's economic development policy. This is, what I'm looking at are the factors that are starting on page 10 of the city's economic development policy. There are a number of factors that the city council has set forth regarding the city's consideration of TIF plans, a number of guidelines. And the introduction to these factors provides that most favorable consideration will be given by the city to plans that include these factors that are listed. I won't cover all of these because they're extensive, but I'll hit some of the high points. The first factor is that the total amount of subsidy from the TIF revenues should be no more than 15% of the total project costs, and the plan complies with that factor. If bonds are issued, there is a factor that deals with the repayment of debt, but in this case, no bonds are requested, as I mentioned. It's purely pay-as-you-go. The city will not provide a general fund annual appropriation pledge to back any debt, and that factor is satisfied since no debt is being requested. Another factor provides that the TIF plan that proposes retail development should encourage the inflow of customers from outside the city and should not divert sales from or cannibalize existing retail in the city. And at this point, the developer has presented only new tenants to the site, is not proposing relocation of any existing businesses in the city. TIF plans that propose redevelopment of existing residential and commercial and industrial areas will be favored. And in this case, you've heard testimony, and I'm sure you're familiar with the nature of the property being surrounded by commercial development, and it seems ripe for commercial development at this point. The next factor indicates that plans should not be in effect for more than 12 years. Anything 12 years or less will be favored, and that factor is satisfied in this case. Developer should contribute not less than 15% of the total project costs in cash equity of the developer, and the developer's spreadsheets indicate that 18% of the total project costs will be from equity sources, so that component is satisfied. The plan should provide for a mandatory declaration of the pilots of at least 50%, and that has been satisfied. That's the amendment that I mentioned last week to clarify that point with a couple of the exhibits. So those are some of the high points from the city's TIF policy, and in each case, all of those various factors, again, just hitting the high points from the TIF policy, have been satisfied by this request. Last procedural issue is the resolution that's been presented to you in your packet. This is Resolution 2016-1. It is written in the affirmative, so in your consideration of this plan, if you pass the resolution, you'll be making a recommendation to the City Council for approval. And if you do not pass the resolution, if the vote fails on the resolution, then that will be passed on as a recommendation against approval of the plan to the City Council. That concludes my presentation, and I'd be happy to answer any questions, or you can move on to questions if you have those for the applicant.
May I have any questions for Mr. Bushak? You're recommending the approval then, sir?
I could say on behalf of the city team that the plan complies with the various factors in the policy, and it is a complete plan for your consideration. I think I would turn to city staff to make any sort of affirmative recommendation, but I'm prepared to state those points to you.
Anybody else? Thank you. Is anybody else from the city that would like to address the commission? None? Okay, well, any testimony from the public in support of the plan, please come up to the podium to address the commission, state your name and address, and try to limit your discussion for 3 minutes. There is none, then we'll have testimony from the public against the plan. Please come up and address the commission, come to the podium, state your name and address, and try to limit your discussion to 3 minutes. There is none. If there had been some, we would have allowed you to readdress. Do you have anything that you'd like to readdress?
No, sir.
Okay. All right. Now have questions from the commission.
Mr. Chair,
Yes, sir.
I have a question for the developer. Could you pull the site map up again as far as the site plan with the stormwater? You had mentioned in the stormwater, I mean, I look at that detention, and this is probably more of a planning question for city staff, but that's a lot of valuable real estate we're losing on your site to stormwater. And I think in your presentation, you had mentioned something about not having access to the regional detention. Did you look at costs or what mechanisms you would need to tie into that system so you could gain some of that real estate there for parking or a larger parcel building?
So the issue is we don't have it's a good question, we don't have the right to get to the regional detention. There are other ways, I mean, the reason I gave the sincere qualification that these buildings can get a little bigger, a little smaller, I give that range on the multi-tenant building. Depending on certain tenants in certain situations, you may be able to actually expand the building enough and pay to put that underground. That's what you're getting at and things
Right.
like that. Right now, we've shown it like this because we always want to say, look, this may be what we do. So really the options are really above and below ground, but
Okay.
not off-site.
Okay, I see.
Yeah.
And have you, I mean, I know there's new technology like pervious concrete they have now they've come out with, so I don't know if you all have looked into options to doing something on that, on the site to perhaps get some more square footage out of the site for another tenant or more revenue producing.
It's a
activity
good
there.
point. I personally haven't discussed that with our civil engineer. I think a lot of times lately with projects, when we turn to, it's a growing trend, turn to the pervious pavement, it's because of best management practices, water quality. And again, remember, I'm the real estate lawyer that knows enough to talk about this, but don't rely on anything I say. But this is a little bit more of a storage, a true detention issue. So, I mean, some of that pervious would take it away. I don't know that it would massively change the size of the detention we need, but it's a good point. And that's the kind of thing we're working through planning with city right now. We'll be working through those issues.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I was just curious, do you have any thoughts right now on what your secondary access and, or egress, if you will, in and out? I know you're thinking, and I would think you would have to have a secondary other than just 58 to get in and out of that area with. Is there any thoughts on what you're planning on doing on that?
We are working on it, and if hopefully you will understand what I mean by this. It's something that we're working on, and so we're trying not to get into the details because this sort of thing we don't have any rights, so it takes negotiations. So
Okay.
that's the kind of posture we're in right now.
But you are looking into it?
Yes, sir.
Okay,
Very
thank you.
seriously.
Any other questions on this side? I'm sorry. I didn't-
Are there any other improvements along 58 with regards to traffic control besides just the decel lane?
The decel lane is the only one that we have identified that we're committed to doing, but our traffic memorandum analysis should be done, we think, by the end of the week. And so if we have to pay attention to that. We need to share that with city, and we'll sit down. If there's anything else, then we'll certainly address that.
Any other question? Yes, sir.
One quick question for the city staff. What's your thoughts on the revenue projections? Do they seem optimistic, conservative? How would you characterize them from your perspective? If you care to have an opinion on that one.
Yeah, we have reviewed the revenue projections, both in the initial stages when the documentation before this plan was submitted, and has been reviewed by the city, and I think it's in line with a reasonable revenue projections based on historic data with the city.
Any other questions from the commission? If not, we'll close the public hearing.
Thanks, Chair.
And now the commissioners can discuss and debate what we've been presented today. I don't have any issues myself. Obviously, there's a lot more taxes that will be brought in to the taxing districts, than that's what's being brought in now, so. Been waiting for that property to develop for several years. It sounds like you have some good anchors and, some commitments. So. Anybody else? we need to consider the resolution at hand.
I was just, Mr. Chair, I was just going to say, I think it looks like a very good conservative plan with the 12-year sunset. On some other TIF plans we've looked at, the 15% as far as what the funding is on the whole plan. That's very nice. It's favorable to me. It meets definitely all the city requirements that city staff put together as far as the TIF policy that the city put forth years ago. So appreciate you all putting that together, and I think this would be a good improvement for the city to have that site developed, because as you mentioned in your comments that you know, that's basically the front door to Raymore, and having that parcel there when everything else is developed around it, it's going to be positive for us to get that site developed as you planned here. So thank you.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just gonna, I would second Mr. Holzman's comments. I think this is pretty well, it's very well vetted out. And having sat up here before wearing a different hat, I do want to thank you guys for being very forward, you know, disclosing everything. This is the first time I've ever had a developer come in front of me anyway and say we have a tough build out and here are the issues, and gone into great detail. I am familiar with Prairie Village Shopping Center. I'm familiar with Corinth, and those are great shopping centers. And so I think what you've done here is very good. Thank you.
Any other commissioners?
A comment maybe. It does look like a responsible plan. It's very reasonable. We appreciate that. The information is presented very well, both from the city's standpoint as well. I would encourage to look at a second entrance exit on that plan, a variety of reasons, and even security possibly as well. And I do like the nod to history of the area, or entrance to Raymore. That's important too.
Any of the other commissioners like to make any comments or questions? The resolution is the Highway 58 and Dean Avenue TIF plan, consideration of resolution number 2016-1 for the Highway 58 and Dean Avenue TIF plan. I'll entertain a motion.
Make a motion to approve the plan as presented.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
So moved, pass unanimously.
Thank you for your time.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, if I may, just really quick, I wanted to briefly go over an upcoming strategic planning effort from the
Sure.
city. February 1st is the first of 3 meetings for Reimagine Raymore, which is a community conversation. I would encourage all the members of the TIF Commission and those sitting in the audience to please come to Eagle Glen Elementary School there on February 1st, 6:30 p.m. Free childcare will be provided, and we really want to receive the public's input on a couple of on some themes. So, just want to mention that.
Great, sounds good. Well, thank everybody for coming, and as
Mr.
we
Chair,
did yes, sir.
One other thing I wanted to clarify for the record. I was jotting down notes when the vote was taken, so I didn't look up. Was the vote unanimous, or
Yes,
were there
sir, it
any?
was.
Oh, okay, just wanted to clarify that. Thanks.
Unless, yes, yeah. It's all adjourned. No, we gotta have a motion for
Move to
adjournment.
adjourn.
Second.
I got a motion, a second to adjourn. All in favor?
Aye.
So moved, pass unanimously.